And three. And we are live. Hello, hello. Good morning, Leon.
Good morning, or should I say good evening, Shantanu.
Yeah, for me, it's good evening. Yes. How are you doing, Leon? How's it going?
Just another day.
Nice. Awesome. I think I'm super excited for the topic today, spec-driven development. And I know you have a lot to cover today, so I won't take much of your time. But once again, thank you so much, Leon, for doing this today. I am super excited about this topic. And without further ado, the stage is all yours. Over to you.
Well, where to begin, right? So spec-driven development isn't exactly entirely new in and of itself, right? The reason that we're even talking about it right now is because we're talking about spec-driven development in an agentic framework, right? So really, why is spec-driven development more relevant now than it was, let's say, a year ago, right? And well, that's two things, right? Or let's say 2 years ago, right? But regardless of how far back you want to go, like LLMs at some point went from purely conversational to agentic, right? If they're conversational, then that exchange is happening between you and me pretty frequently. So when that happens, you are the spec. Your brain is the spec, essentially, right? As these models and these platforms like Zencoder are capable of harnessing agentic development, you're capable of longer running executions, right? And when you're capable of longer running executions, then you're essentially trusting the agent a little bit more if you're going to let that run independently. Now, models are starting to come out with something called steerability, which means being able to add input while it's actually running instead of pausing execution, right? But if you expect an independent run, or if you expect changes to make sense across any sort of large scale, then think about it like a human, right? Then they need to know how the house is built, right? If they're going to be adding a new wing instead of adding a vase. Fair enough? Without constant supervision from you, the architect.
Makes sense. I mean, I totally agree to your point, and I've been reading about it lately, and I guess there's another step, another process that people evidently follow, which is TDD, test-driven development. So, what's your take on that? What do you think about test-driven development and spec-driven development? How do you differentiate between them if you're somebody who's just getting started?
Yeah. So look, I'm probably not the only engineer in the room that isn't the biggest fan of writing tests, right?
Mhm.
But to be fair, test-driven development to a degree is sort of like a mirror of spec-driven development, right? It describes the way you want your application to behave from the perspective of the actual code logic, right? I would say that spec-driven development is sort of just the human mirror of that, where
Mhm.
you define at a pretty low level detail how you expect the application to behave from an experience perspective, right? Now, they're not mutually exclusive, right? From the spec-driven development, you can give birth to a really sophisticated series of tests that reflects the experience that you want to see, right? But it just shifts the perspective from thinking about how your code is going to run to thinking about how your end user is going to experience whatever it is that you're building or modifying.
Got it.
But when I say they're not mutually exclusive, right? Like,
Mhm.
and we're going to get into state tracking, I think, at some point in this conversation, because that's another really important part of long running executions, right? And it's important for a couple of reasons. But part or a way to solve for those really long running executions is in measuring test pass or fail rates, right? So I would argue that TDD is almost a part of spectrum development, or SDD, whatever you want to
Mhm.
call it. But
Mhm.
by no means mutually exclusive. It's just a different way of thinking about the problem.
Makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I've just read across the blog that you wrote, the guide that you wrote last week, which you launched. I just shared it across with the community as well. Would love to hear your thoughts if you can, throw some light on vibe coding that's been prevailing right there in the industry, and what differentiate vibe coding and spec-driven development. I mean, what's your thought? I just wanted to prick your brains on that.
I'm pretty sure. I mean, I don't know. I don't keep tabs on the Oxford English Dictionary, but I'm pretty sure that vibe coding is yet to make its way into,
Yep.
the word of the year or whatever, which means that when you say vibe coding, that's going to mean something different from person to person. Now, for most people, I feel like at this point, it means just putting in what you think of, right, into that chat box and hoping that what comes out is what you want to see, right? In other words, when I say vibe coding, there's a vibe. And if there's a vibe, that means you are present for that vibe. Agents do not feel vibes, as far as I know, right? So when we're talking about spec-driven development, we are talking about the opportunity to define what needs to happen over a large scale, and not just a large scale, but also a reasonably long period of time relative to what we normally experience when we think about vibe coding, where we are in that chair for the prompt and then for the output, the final output of that prompt, right?
Yep.
So, okay, let me give you an example, right? I was doing some work at the airport a couple weeks ago, and I gave the agent in Zencoder a pretty detailed spec of some of the changes that I wanted to see. And we could talk about how to develop a good spec later, but I gave it a detailed spec, right? And asked it to use the majority of all of its context window to accomplish the task effectively, right? Or to come to an effective stopping point. I started that after I got to my gate. It wasn't finished running before I had to close my laptop and board the plane. Okay. And I wasn't late. Okay. So it was running for a while. And it wasn't wasting time either, right? It was a large scale code change, right? It was a large scale feature.
Right.
Now, look, agents can obviously run long for a variety of reasons, good and bad, right? So obviously you want to have safety mechanisms in place, right? You don't want a doom loop of this execution didn't work. Let me try it again and again and again and again and again. We've gotten pretty good at catching those, I feel like. But regardless, this was not that. This was actual productive work happening over a large scale, and more importantly, off of a detailed spec. So how does that work, right? A detailed spec can be broken down when it's well formatted into a series of tasks, right? So you can think of each one of those tasks as sort of a prompt. But with a proper spec plus state tracking, it's not like you just inputted 10 prompts simultaneously across the board, right? They're sequential, and they're not just sequential, but if implemented properly, then they're informed by the progress that's been made in the ladder. So a spec is a living, breathing thing that is subject to adaptation to the environment, right? Just like no battle plan survives contact with the enemy, no spec survives unchanged with contact with your code base, right?
Right.
And so when that spec is broken down into tasks, the way that task, let's say 10, is going to be executed is going to end up looking differently from how it was initially defined in that spec. And it's going to look differently because of the lessons learned by the agent in executing tasks 1 through 9, right? So the spec is there to guide, but not prescriptively define the approach. It is there to guide the desired result from an experience level, not necessarily an implementation level.
Makes sense. Yeah, I mean, as you just mentioned, right, spec is more towards getting instructions sorted out before you jump into the development part. So I feel there are like 4 parts here, right? One is you specify what you want. I mean, defining the spec. Next is across the planning part of it, right? You plan what you need, what needs to be implemented, what tech stack needs to be taken care of, and stuff like that. And then breaking down into multiple tasks, chunks of tasks on each bifurcation of tasks. And then comes the last part, which is implementation. So, can you brief a bit more about these 4 steps a bit, and then maybe we can walk into the nitty-gritties and do like a small short demo of how to write a good spec.
Okay, so the thing about running a good spec is, at the end of the day, you have to appreciate that it's going to evolve. And if it's going to evolve, then that means that as much as you want to get your hands dirty with the engineering side of things, you have to consider the fact that the implementation is not the main concern, right? So when you're planning that spec, you have to think about the experience, right? What is that experience informed by? That experience is informed by either what you know about your product or what your team knows about your product, plus what you know about the capabilities of your product as it stands. Okay. And by the way, this is not necessarily something that you need to format or figure out how to do on your own, because the really cool thing is that there are communities, there are people out there that have started. And by the way, I did not invent spec-driven development, right? I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here just talking about it, right? So for example, a really popular GitHub library called Spec-Kit is something that you can use today to actually build that spec, right? We also have a spec generation agent directly in Zencoder for that exact purpose, right? So this is something that helps you think about not just how to structure your code, but how to structure desired behavior. So that's what you do at the high level. And then breaking it down into tasks, I would say that the task level is actually something that works really well in conjunction with an agent, because the agent knows how to structure tasks in ways that are compatible with the capabilities of that model under the hood, right? There are small language models, there are large language models. There are large language models suited for smaller tasks, and there are large language models that are suited for much longer running tasks. When I wrote the Spec-Driven Development Guide, I was using Sonnet 4.5 as a reference. It had just come out, and it had come out with some pretty cool features like steerability for one, but also with an inclination towards state tracking, right? And of managing its own context window very well, right? Of basically context window awareness to a degree which other models had not yet had, right? So in other words, a model that's self-aware of its own capabilities. And a model that's self-aware of its own capabilities will help you divide up your spec into tasks that it can handle across context windows, right? So basically slicing the cake in a way that the agent can eat it, right? Without getting too full or staying too hungry. So that's the task level, right? And then implementation, right? Well, implementation could look as simple as pressing go, or it could involve a sort of joint operation where you are at the computer watching everything unfold. And by the way, now that agents are getting fast, and also parallel tool execution is getting really fast, not only is it really fun to watch, but also now that they're increasingly steerable, you don't have to worry about, am I going to pause execution if I don't think it's going down the right direction here, right? You can just put the input in, and that'll help steer it as it's going. So personally, I'm a fan of the joint operation approach right now, especially for long running tasks. A, because I find it enjoyable, and B, because, well, at the end of the day, I still know better than anyone or any agent what the desired end behavior that I want to see. And I also know some gotchas that I might not have included as warning labels, at the outset, right? Mm-hmm. Now, if I'm not babysitting it, I'm confident that still that spec will either result in a completed scope of work that one way or another accomplishes what I want, or for some reason there's an obstacle and it lets me know, right? But that is the difference between, if we back up, between the spec phase and the plan phase, right? So I kind of jumped right into, because we're talking about specify, plan, task, implement, or execute, right? So I kind of jumped right from the plan to task mode, right? But if we back up from spec to plan, you go from the desired behavior in the spec phase to the implementation approach, the plan of attack, essentially, in that plan phase, right? And that's another place where your agent really shines, right? Because agents are great at crawling through code bases and understanding existing frameworks. If they have access to multi-repository search, like you do with Zencoder, then they're really good at understanding frameworks, not just used in that code base, but across your repositories, across all of the elements of your system, right? Nobody can specify, nobody can write that spec the way that you can write that spec, right? When it gets to the planning phase, that should be a collaborative process with you and with the agent, right? And that is a really good place to discover gotchas, like, oh no, don't use that pattern or library for this approach. I hadn't thought of that, but don't use it for XYZ reason, right? And then you can go from there. You can shape, you can iterate. But at the end of the day, it should be a collaborative process. You should always read over the plan to make sure there are no gotchas there. Even though it's tempting to go, sounds, let's move on to breaking it down into tasks.
100%. I mean, I totally agree on that front. Those four, I think those are like the most, essential phases of spec-driven development. And talking about the first step, which is the writing the specifications or defining the spec, do you mind sharing a few tips and tricks of how do you best define it? Or maybe if you can, share some, prompts around it. What do you think?
Yeah, well, for one, I would say struggle a little bit. You should struggle a little bit. Like that's my personal. You should grapple with what is actually important, because build a social feature into my app is easy to say and it's easy to think of, right? But that is not a spec, right? And when you get into the nitty-gritty, you have to really think about what kind of behaviors you actually want to see. Do you want to follow or do you want to friend? What's the pros and cons of each, right? Not from an implementation perspective, but from a user perspective, from an actual experience perspective. What does that mean? What does that say about your application, right? And so do not offload the cognitive work of the end experience to your agent. Do not offload it. Feel free to collaborate. And I've spent many an hour in voice mode because I'm a pacer. I like to pace. I spent many hours in voice mode talking about specifications of what an end experience should look like, right? So if you're asking for a prompt, I'd say the most important thing is don't worry about implementation for now while we do this specification planning, right? Because this is dedicated entirely to experience and we'll figure out the implementation piece later. It's really important to segment, right? To sort of separate in your mind and in the agent's mind, essentially, these phases, right? Because you don't want to intermingle what's existing with what's the desired end result. You don't want some skeuomorphic representation of what's possible in your code base based on what exists, right? You want something that makes sense for the vision, really, right? The vision that you're trying to achieve, but you have to clarify that vision. Specification is a clarification, a crystallization of that vision.
Makes sense. By the way, Leon has a question for you. So he asks you, do you use Zencoder to develop spec or use any other tool? So he wants your secret out. By the way.
When SpecKit came out, I love playing with that. SpecKit is a great way to start because SpecKit sort of intrinsically separates out those 4 steps, right? And it is the early manifestation of this approach, right? Of this framework. So when SpecKit came out, I played around a lot with that. And then since we're talking about specific tools, we haven't really started talking about state tracking yet, which is sort of the practical way in which to have long-running executions work. And I'll touch on that in a second. But recently a new library came out called Beads by a fellow called Steve Yeag. That seems pretty exciting. So I've been playing around with that a little bit for state tracking because there's a couple ways to do that. But now I use Encoder. To develop my specs. I actually built my own custom agent. And then we are releasing a publicly available spec agent that you will be able to grab in our catalog. And you can just come into Zencoder, look at the catalog, and then install with one click. But so yeah, now I use Encoder, but the actual framework is built off of, like I said, shoulders of giants, libraries that have come before me. Question from Vibber.
Yeah, we have a bunch of questions. I'll just walk through them.
Okay.
Yeah, so Vibber has a question. He asks, does it make sense to do meta prompt, use Encoder to give you an overview of the repo, and then feed the same into AI to help you write specs?
Classic Vibber. All right, Vibber, here's what's up. All right, so meta prompts. There's a couple different ways to think about the meta prompt, right? But so first of all, if you want an overview of the repo, for those of you that don't know, Zencoder has a repo info agent, and what that does is basically it runs over your whole repo, and then gives you a repo.md file right near the root directory at the end of the day, and that's basically your agent's README, right? So that is for your agent to get an up-to-date understanding of how your code works, what it does, and where things live, right? So if you feed a meta prompt into Zencoder, just point blank, and expect it to then feed that repository information to help guide writing that spec, it's a trade-off, right? Because and look, you feel free to disagree, right? But I feel like personally, it's kind of like joining a new company, right? You can either join it with fresh ID, like all the fresh ideas, not knowing the internal architecture, right? And then on the flip side, you have experienced product managers that know what exists and what the current capacity is. So I would actually say I would flip it, right? I would do that repo analysis informed by the spec rather than the spec being informed by the repo analysis, if that makes sense. Because I think that lets you come into it with a fresher perspective that's not guided by what exists, but rather what could be. I know we've got a lot of questions. I just want to touch on the state tracking element for 1 second, because it's important, right? When we're talking about long-running executions, then even the most sophisticated models today, you don't want to overstuff the goose. If it really is a sophisticated feature, right? Or even take the example where I was running, this really large scope of work, and then I had to run off to the airport, right? Close my laptop or run off onto the airplane, board the airplane, right? Close my laptop, and local processes. B, no internet connection when you're boarding the plane, right? So it has to stop. Now, to pick up that work, I can hypothetically just resume that run, but even so, that run now has thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of tokens worth of context in it. State tracking is about tracking what work has been done and what has worked and what has not worked in terms of implementation in some sort of external data store, right? And that can be something as simple as a progress.txt file that you instruct your agent to periodically update, right? It can and should be combined with atomic commits, right? So that if something does have to be rolled back or something does have to be audited later, then it's in that commit history, even if you're working on a different work tree, right? Because even if you don't have to roll back, right? Even if you can just switch over to your old work tree, your agent needs those breadcrumbs, right? And another great way to actually track progress is in writing those tests that reflect your spec, and then having a tests.json file that basically overviews, okay, for this feature, for this section, how many of these tests are now passing, how many are failing, how many are passing, how many are failing, so that you are no longer as worried about context window management, and your agent doesn't have to be as worried about context window management. It can live with accomplishing 1 or 2 tasks per agent run delivering the lessons learned, the progress made to those state trackers, wherever they may live or however you may want to format them, and then handing off to the next agent to continue work from there, right? And so you offload a lot of that responsibility from each individual agent into a system of agents sort of handing off, right, from the master data that you're tracking as it's happening, if that makes sense. And that's what you really want to be doing, because you want to know if something's not working, why it didn't work. You don't want to have to scroll through the rest of the history. You might not even want to have to ask the agent, because at the end of the day, the way that agents manage context, like first in, first out, or another method, right? You want it to be auditing its own progress as it's happening. And that's how you build a really resilient spec-driven approach. Okay, with that said, we can jump back into it.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Leon, we have a few questions if you don't mind taking them up.
Not at all.
Okay, there you go. We have one from Polycarp. Some time back, I was working on DDD, CQRS, and event sourcing pattern architecture, but somehow Zencoder was violating the spec. It was mixing up layers. Why?
Okay. I don't know enough about what you're talking about. I'm straight up Polycarp. Like, I would love to get into it if I knew what you were talking about, but we do have a Slack community where we can talk about it all day. On a general level, I'll say if Zencoder or any other platform or any other model starts violating stuff in the spec, and it's crucial that things align. Was it violating the spec in terms of format or behavior, and sort of like to what degree? But I will say, this is a separate conversation, that it's like doing structured output is a great way when the implementation approach matters as much as the behavior. You can format your output as structured rather than like just general stream text. But we can get into it. Okay. You're on mute, Sean.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I think the last question, Leon, is again from Leon. Can I use .md progress and test file for state or progress tracking? And Zencoder can update this file as we move along the functionality.
That's how I do it. I actually combine that. I have a progress.txt file, right? Mm-hmm. That tracks lessons learned, progress made, tasks completed, tasks still to go, right? And I also have a test.json file that for each task has, for this task, test passed, test still failing, right? So at any point, if I pause execution or if the context window is just up for that agentic run, you know exactly where to start from, or the agent knows exactly where to start from in that implementation and execution phase. But that said, like I said, there's also some pretty exciting libraries coming out for different methods to track state. Again, beads is one of them, but the approach that you're suggesting is one that I'm familiar with and I use all the time.
Awesome. I think that's all from the community side. If you guys have any more questions, drop them on our community, Slack, Discord. Me, Leon, Alex, we're there on the community. So we'll pick them up. We'll be happy to support and answer your questions. I think that's it for the day. Leon, before we close down for the day, do you have any final statement to make or final thoughts that you want to put forward?
I actually do. Yeah, you would be surprised, and I've just been thinking about this lately, you would be surprised by some specs that you may have already lying around without even knowing it. And I mean that in terms of any old articles, any old projects ideas, any old projects that you built years ago when you were first starting out as an engineer and it doesn't work or it's super janky, but that code does contain the desired behavior. Maybe the worst implementation you've ever seen, but it does contain the desired behavior. So from that, you can actually build a really great spec and maybe, just maybe, bring your vision into a new life of its own now that, the technology is available to bring the vision to life with the experience that you have and with the knowledge that these agents provide.
Makes sense. That's absolutely right. Do you mind taking a last question before we close? Or?
Go for it.
Yeah, I think Oh, it's again from Polycarp. Why is that the repo info does not automatically update when you make changes to an application?
If we're talking about the repo info agent, so that is something that we typically run at the outset when first cloning a large repo, or really any repository, to get the structure of that repo.md file down in a way that's really agent friendly, right? And in a way that captures the most important elements of how that agent is going to work with it. But you can always instruct your coding agent to then continuously update that repo.md file as it works, right? So it's not to say that any agent can't also do it, but there is a difference between setting it up for success and then keeping it consistent.
Interesting. Perfect. I think that's it for today. Thank you so much, Leon, for joining in. I think this was wonderful. And thank you so much for throwing your thoughts. I'll just drop down the guide that you have written again so people can follow through. And if you're somebody who's just picking up, just trying to build out and follow the spec-driven development, make sure you follow this guide written by one and only Leon. So once again, thank you, Leon. And again, thanks everybody for joining in today. Thank you so much from wherever you're signing in. Take care. We'll see you again in the next one. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.